The catalyst and current state. For decades, we lived by the gospel of frictionless globalism. Supply chains stretched across continents, optimizing for cost, promising endless availability. Then came the pandemic, revealing cracks in this meticulously constructed edifice. From empty shelves to soaring prices, the illusion of seamless global trade began to shatter. We are now witnessing a profound re-evaluation, a structural shift often termed de-globalization.
Companies once fixated solely on just-in-time inventory and lowest-cost production faced an existential crisis. The disruption wasn't merely a hiccup, it was a systemic shock that exposed vulnerabilities never truly priced into our models. Resilience, not just efficiency, suddenly became the corporate imperative. This mandated a complete rethink of supply chain architecture, moving beyond purely financial metrics.
I remember trying to buy a new refrigerator during the pandemic. 6-month waiting lists were the norm, and prices had jumped significantly. It wasn't just electronics. Everyday items, from car parts to medicines, faced shortages. You really felt how interconnected everything was, and how fragile that connection could be. This wasn't just an abstract economic concept. It was impacting our daily lives directly.
The data confirms this sentiment shift emphatically. Global Trade Alert's Reshoring Tracker saw a 20% increase in announced reshoring policies and incentives post-2020. Shipping costs, while volatile, showed prolonged spikes that dwarfed pre-pandemic averages, making distant production less attractive. Foreign direct investment patterns are also subtly shifting, with a deceleration in cross-border M&A relative to previous decades. These are not isolated incidents, but harbingers of a broader trend towards regionalization.
This isn't merely a temporary correction, it's a strategic reorientation with far-reaching implications. It's a journey into a world where economic efficiency might take a backseat to national security and domestic stability. Underlying structural drivers. The post-World War II era saw the relentless march of globalization, culminating in the golden age of the early 21st century. Institutions like the WTO championed free trade, encouraging nations to specialize, building an intricately woven global economy. China's ascension into the global manufacturing powerhouse amplified this trend, integrating billions into the world market. But the very forces that propelled globalization are now, ironically, creating the conditions for its partial retreat.
Geopolitical tensions are undeniable primary drivers today. The US-China strategic rivalry, for instance, transcends trade tariffs, encompassing technological decoupling and data sovereignty. Governments are increasingly viewing critical sectors, such as semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and rare earths, through a national security lens. This prompts policies designed to onshore production or secure supplies from trusted allies, regardless of immediate cost. The war in Ukraine further underscored the fragility of energy and food supply chains, accelerating regional alignment.
From an economic theory perspective, the unquestioned dominance of comparative advantage is being challenged. While free trade generally maximizes global welfare, the political and strategic risks of hyperspecialization are now being quantified. The concept of strategic autonomy is gaining traction, prompting nations to consider the trade-offs between cost efficiency and supply chain robustness. Our risk matrices are evolving to include geopolitical stability and environmental vulnerability alongside traditional market risks. This is a departure from the purely econometric models that dominated corporate strategy for decades.
For many workers in former manufacturing hubs, the promise of globalization felt like a betrayal. Jobs disappeared overseas, communities struggled, and the talk of reshoring feels like a glimmer of hope. However, the reality of bringing back manufacturing isn't always simple. The skills gap is significant. There's also the question of whether new domestic jobs will pay enough to justify potentially higher consumer prices. The rhetoric is appealing, but the practicalities for the average worker are complex and often uncertain.
These drivers, geopolitical friction, strategic autonomy, and a re-evaluation of economic vulnerabilities, are not ephemeral. They represent deep-seated structural forces reshaping the very foundations of global commerce. Institutional and consumer divergence. The shift towards resilience is creating a divergence between national strategic objectives and consumer expectations. What does this look like on the ground, both for corporations and the everyday shopper?
We're seeing tangible evidence of companies recalibrating their global footprints. Apple, for example, is reportedly exploring diversifying some production away from China into countries like India and Vietnam. Semiconductor giants are receiving significant government incentives to build fabs in the US and Europe. This isn't just reshoring to the home country, it's often nearshoring or friendshoring, moving production to geographically closer or politically aligned nations. The goal is redundancy and reduced political risk, even if it adds to operational expenditure.
Our analysis of corporate earnings calls reveals a notable uptick in mentions of supply chain resilience, geopolitical risk, and diversification. Capital expenditure reports show increased investment in automation and domestic capacity expansion across key sectors like automotive and defense. Yet the costs are considerable. Building a new semiconductor plant, for example, can run into tens of billions of dollars. These investments invariably translate into higher production costs, which eventually filter down to the consumer. We're tracking a measurable deceleration in global trade growth compared to pre-crisis trends, signaling this fragmentation.
The narrative for consumers is often, buy local, support domestic. But the reality is that local production is usually more expensive, sometimes significantly so. If my options are a $100 toaster made overseas, or a $150 toaster made domestically, many families will still choose the cheaper option. We're already struggling with inflation, and the cost of resilience feels like another burden. The ethical argument for supporting local industries is strong, but the practical impact on my household budget is undeniable.
This divergence presents a critical challenge. How do policymakers balance the imperatives of national security and economic resilience with the realities of consumer purchasing power? Forward macro projections. The path forward suggests a more complex, multipolar economic landscape. This isn't an undoing of globalization entirely, but rather a fundamental reshaping.
Governments are recognizing the need for proactive industrial policy. The CHIPS Act in the US and similar initiatives in the EU are examples of direct state intervention to foster strategic industries domestically. We anticipate a proliferation of bilateral trade agreements focused on trusted partners, superseding multilateral frameworks in certain sectors. The role of state-backed entities and strategic investment funds will likely expand, further blurring the lines between public and private capital. This new era demands a far more active and strategic role from national governments in shaping economic outcomes.
The macroeconomic implications are profound. We project a potential for persistent inflationary pressures as supply chains become less optimized for cost and more for security. Regionalization could lead to the formation of distinct trading blocs, potentially reducing overall global economic efficiency and growth rates. Companies will face increased compliance costs and a more fragmented regulatory environment. The Global South, which benefited immensely from open trade, may find itself navigating a more protectionist and bifurcated world economy.
For consumers, this means adapting to a new normal. We might see fewer choices in some product categories, or a greater differentiation in pricing based on origin. The idea of a universal, endlessly cheap product might become a relic of the past. Understanding where our goods come from and the true cost of their production will become more transparent and important. It's about recognizing the trade-offs involved in building a more secure but potentially more expensive economic future.
We are witnessing the end of one economic era and the difficult, uncertain birth of another. The shattered web of globalization is being painstakingly restitched, but not into the seamless fabric we once knew. Instead, we anticipate a mosaic of regional blocs, strategic alliances, and national priorities, each vying for resilience in an increasingly volatile world. The journey ahead promises both challenges and opportunities as the global economy recalibrates its fundamental architecture.